Now it's time for our program, and I think we're in for a special treat. And it really is truly related to our centennial year as well, because Joe Grødahl has done a lot of study about the history of the church. And he has kind of an interesting twist that he wants to talk about. He wants to give us an idea of how the church name became Mindekirken, not just Mindekirken, but there are many other things and surprises he'll be sharing with us. So please welcome Joe Grødahl.
All right, thank you, Marilyn. Okay, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me on Zoom. And all right, that behind me. So it may look funny if I'm standing up here with my phone, but that's because I'm reading my notes off of the phone. So I'm not just texting with my friends while talking to you. Just FYI, I might do a little bit of that too. No. Anyway, so as Marilyn said, many of you might already know me, Joseph Grødahl. I'm the Programs and Events Director at Norway House, which I've been for the last 4 months. But for the last couple decades, I've been one of the many amateur historians we have here at Mindekirken. Many more capable and knowledgeable people than I come before me and after me. So I think especially of Marianne Olsen, some of you might remember. She was really an expert on our stained glass windows and the stories that they tell. Of course, Gracia, our leader of the Centennial Committee. And Kaya is texting me to tell me to tip the screen so Zoom can see me. Hi, Zoom. Okay. And Gracia, our leader of our Centennial Committee, has done just phenomenal work in piecing together the story of this church as we approach our centennial year. So I just hope to add a little bit to that discussion. Today, what I really want to focus on is how we are a memorial church, how that began, and what that means. Both what that meant 100 years ago and what that means today. So I think I'm hoping that will lead into a discussion-heavy time today. So I'm going to try to not drone on too much. But I want to give just a little flavor of weaving together that story of the early years of the church and how we got here. So let me just play with the technology for a minute to make sure that it's working. To go over here. Make sure that Zoom can see that. Okay, I think everyone on Zoom can see this as well. Like I said, I would like to have a little bit of Q&A time after. So for the Zoom people, please use the chat window to give me any of your questions as we go. And then for everyone else, just please think through what thoughts you might have. So let's go to, oops. Oh, maybe I use this, I'm sorry. Figured it out. Okay, so I want to start with just a little bit, and this is going to be rehashing for some of you who have heard recent programs about the history of the founding of the church, but just painting a little landscape of the status of the Norwegian language in churches and just American society in general in 1922, and really right after World War I. So Norwegians were not considered to be one of the more threatening immigrant groups, but we were still lumped in with everyone else as we were using a language other than English. Really the attitude was that everybody should be learning English and adopting American customs right after World War I. And it was in this backdrop that the church was formed. So I thought I would just start with a couple little anecdotes from one of the more famous Norwegian Americans we have, Oye Rolvåg, author of Giants of the Earth. I assume many of you have heard of him. And kind of talk about that perspective of language and the role that had in churches. So as he says here, it's unthinkable that a time will come when Norwegian is not used as a vehicle of culture and education among a rather large number of Americans with Norwegian roots. As long as it is possible to reach into the heart of a single person better by preaching in Norwegian than it is the simple duty of the church to use Norwegian as a means of communication insofar as that person is concerned. And by the way, this is in 1919, he's writing this. It should be the churches who seek out the new immigrant rather than leaving it up to him to seek out the church. The newcomer has all the shyness toward strangers that is characteristic of Norwegians. Sound familiar? And so the newcomer drifts about among us like a stranger among strangers. He doesn't know us, and we aren't so sure about him. Even people without much formal education would see that the language of our forefathers, the language of our kin, is of priceless value to our children. He doesn't say there whether or not you know the language. It's just the language itself, what little bit you might know. It has a place in our hearts. So now I want to recount a little conversation he had with some St. Olaf students, and this is to give you an idea of what would by that point be third, fourth, even fifth generation Norwegian immigrants that he's talking to. That at St. Olaf they had a beginning level Norwegian class, and this was reserved only for those who were confirmed in church in English and who really didn't know Norwegian. And so in this group, he says, "Do any of you speak Norwegian?" And they all shake their heads. "Do any of you understand Norwegian?" Same answer. Then he asked, "Well, how many of you were present at the installation ceremony yesterday?" They all held up their hands. "So none of you understood Dr. Stug's speech?" "Oh, yes," was the answer from the class. "We understood that. It was a sermon." The point being that it's the church context. It's special. Church is a matter of the heart. Language is a matter of the heart. And that is treated separately than what language they might use talking to their friends on the street. So now we fast forward a little bit to when it came time to start this congregation. And what I'm focusing on is what was the message put out in the press locally, and by press I mean some English language press, but mostly Norwegian press. There's a thriving Norwegian language press locally at the time. And even it had regional reach too. And so what was the message being put out, why this congregation was being started? So one of the things that they were writing is that it would be to serve those who had been in the country for less than 15 years. In other words, to serve farmers that settle in the city who might wish to belong to such a congregation, or to possibly encourage an existing church to commit to using exclusively Norwegian, with the understanding that this new congregation would join them. So in there, does anyone see any mention of memorial? No. None whatsoever. Again, now to January 3rd, this is 6 days before the charter members meeting that actually formed the congregation. They had several meetings like this in different places around the city in the couple weeks before, and huge crowds gathered. I mean, this is 100+ people, and keep in mind it was 35 people who signed the charter on the night. So not everybody that was showing up was actually a member, which is reflected today too in people like myself. I'm an associate member. Many of us are either friends or associate members of the church, not necessarily full members. This might not necessarily be our Sunday church, but we're very supportive, wanting to see this place exist and thrive. And so you can see it's already from the very beginning. We had 2/3 of the people showing up to these meetings had no intention of being full members right away, or ever. But at this meeting, and this is the message being put out to the public, that the purpose of the new congregation was to maintain exclusive use of the Norwegian language, to provide a gathering place for young Norwegians in the city that would remind them of their homeland. And then, like I said, the most didn't have an intention of joining fully. And so, oops, that's jumping a little bit ahead. I'm not gonna get to that yet. And so the point is that it started. This is how it started. This is how it thought of itself. It was focused on the language. It was focused on appealing to these new immigrants, and it had a special draw. It was never going to be seen as just a neighborhood church. It wasn't an ordinary church to begin with. And even we saw that with the charter members, that 1/3 of the charter members who signed on January 9th lived in the immediate neighborhood. And another third lived a little bit further afield in South Minneapolis. And then another third lived in far-flung corners of Minneapolis or suburbs, or one woman from South Dakota. So the point being that it's always been this regional church with a draw, but its focus to start with was language, was creating home for new immigrants. And I think of one cute example of how this new congregation was perceived from the outside. And that was a little letter that came into the congregation a few months after they started from a woman named Fru Hinset from Nolan, South Dakota, who wrote to the congregation that she had seen an ad in Lutheraneren, the Lutheran, the second largest Norwegian language paper at the time in the country. She said, "I saw this ad in the Lutheran to support a congregation in Minneapolis for some old folks who will only use Norwegian." So she was happy to send $5, which at the time was about $50 today. So already, that was the perception, both within and without the church, that's what it was about. Only. And then as the congregation started, again, remembering that the name of this group was the Norsk Lutherske Menighet, the Norwegian Lutheran congregation. It was a little bit of a slow start for fundraising. They had various different locations they met in for the first couple of years, not much consistency, a fairly small group that stuck it out for this first period of time. And they started thinking about options of which church or location they might make their permanent home so that they could continue being this outreach focused on the language to these new immigrants. And some of their focus in that first year were Indre Mission style revival meetings and things, at different locations around the city. And it was really there wasn't one physical location. It was moving around a lot. So, where did the word memorial start getting mentioned? I come to a name that we're going to hear a lot about over the next year, and that is Reverend C.J. Eastvold. He was really, I think in some ways to me, he was to Mindekirken what John Pedersen was in some ways to Norwayhouse. Wouldn't exist in its current form as we know it without his sort of behind the scenes but also public movements. And so, as I said, this fundraising is slow and struggling. And so he also, one of the hats he wore, he was never a member of the church, by the way, but he preached at it, he helped at meetings and things. I think he probably thought of it as his baby. But in August 1924, so 2.5 years after the congregation started, he came around to form an agreement between the Stavanger Amtlag, one of the big logs, which he was the president of, or at least a leader of, and the congregation, where the Stavanger log would drive fundraising efforts for the church. And in return, the church would get a rather clunky name, in my opinion, no offense to Stavanger, Stavanger Amtslag Memorial, dedicated to the Norwegian Lutheran Congregation of Minneapolis. So I'm not sure if there's any marketing people in the crowd. I wonder what they might think of that branding. But that's really the first mention of the word memorial. And now I'm about to start talking about this 1925 North American Centennial Celebration a little bit. And one of the reasons I wanted to really talk about this topic is because obviously we're starting our centennial, but in 3 years we're also going to have the bicentennial of Norwegian immigration in 2025. It's not going to look anything like the 1925 celebration, but we're still going to put on a party. But I bring that up because Stavanger has a key role in that story, because the slooper, the restoration that left Stavanger in 1825 and landed in New York was Restoration came from Stavanger. And this first centennial celebration was in some ways provoked by the Stavanger log. And other Bygdelogs came on board, and other groups too. It was really driven by the Bygdelogs, kind of the brainchild of the Stavanger log. And many people say it was the brainchild of Eastfold himself. But I bring this up here to show that even in the first year, March or April of 1922, the congregation formed a committee, including Joe Grødahl, one of the charter members, to build a little replica of the restoration to bring to the NLCA, forerunner to the ELCA, the Norwegian Church in America, their annual meeting that summer, 1922. They brought a little model of that. What that tells me, even though they weren't necessarily thinking of the word memorial yet at that point, that the congregation perhaps had already, this is speculation on my part, but the congregation perhaps already begun to think of itself beyond just a outreach mission to reach the spiritual needs of recent immigrants who needed things to be in the region, to really put itself right in the center of the story, the whole big story of Norwegian immigration, by tying this new congregation to the story of the restoration. And I'm pretty sure, Gracia might correct me, but I'm pretty sure Christian Brulo was the one from Molde. It's not from Stavanger itself. So this wasn't just a Stavanger social club. I mean, this was the congregation tying itself to that story. So now we're approaching the beginning of this North American Centennial celebration, a huge celebration. And what that came to mean for this new congregation. It was a pivotal year in many ways for the congregation in 1925. But to start, in March, they had been for months negotiating with Bethlehem Lutheran Church to purchase their church and move in and make that their permanent home. And many of you might already know the story of the Young People's Society from Bethlehem, that led by John Pedersen's great aunt, Katrina Thorsen, that folded into the new congregation. So Bethlehem, that was a big part of the early years, was this relationship with Bethlehem Church. But that purchase fell through in March of 1925. In April of 1925, Eastfold, who again wasn't a member, but he was a frequent visitor and in the meetings and preached a lot. He and several members formed a committee and began searching for a lot. And even they knew that their present pastor, Hulting, from Grand Forks, wasn't going to be around much longer as a pastor. So they asked him to become the permanent pastor, the next pastor, and he didn't say yes or no right away. He just said, "I'll take some time to think about it." And in May, Hu Teng resigns, and this isn't disparaging of him. He came on as self-described as not a terribly energetic pastor. He was in his waning days, so he was just there to provide some stability. He resigned May 31st of 1925, which was 6 days before the beginning of this massive centennial celebration at St. Paul at the State Fairgrounds. And so Eastfold still hadn't committed to being the permanent pastor, but he was still a bit of a shepherd for the group heading into the centennial. Obviously, he didn't have much free time because I think he was helping organize this massive centennial celebration. But and then also what happened in May, again, right before the centennial began, was they chose this lot. There's a couple of old houses on this spot, and they had to be torn down. They came upon this lot. It was for $3,600, I think, which is maybe $45,000 in today's money. And so then in June, like it says, the centennial celebration went from the 6th to the 9th, and following the centennial, I'll get into that a little bit later, Eastfold really pushed the congregation to really focus their fundraising drives on tying this congregation to this story that came out of this centennial celebration. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of picture of what the cities were like in 1925 for this big celebration. This is Dayton's department store on Nicollet Mall, draped in a huge Norwegian flag, American flag. Everybody was getting behind it. This was Nicollet Mall. I don't know how well you can see the picture, but lots of American flags and plenty of large Norwegian flags lining the street. Lots of people. It was a big festive atmosphere. The President Coolidge, came to visit. The president of the parliament from Norway came, as well as the ambassador with official greetings from the king. The Bishop of Oslo came. Just a pretty big deal. It was in total 160,000 people came to the state fairgrounds. And I should also note, by the way, that all along there would be a centennial celebration in New York City, which there will probably be again in 2025 because that's where the ship landed. But it was Eastfold's idea and others to have a celebration in the Norwegian capital of America, which is what we are. So, and we're hoping to do that again. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip here to show you, in the midst of all this celebration, this centennial celebration, 160,000 people, the centrality of church life to what celebrating this Norwegian immigrant story meant to most Norwegian Americans at the time. Of the 160,000 people that came to this centennial, over 60,000 attended the Norwegian language church services at the state fairgrounds. They also had some English language church services, and much like at Mindekirken, they were slightly less attended than the Norwegian language one, but still well attended. So I just want to give you a little clip. I came upon this little treasure, a little clip. This is a silent film. It's 1925, but showing you a couple of venues at the state fairgrounds, how full they are of people for these church services in Norwegian. Let's see if I can maximize it. North services in the Hippodrome at 10 o'clock. Which, fun fact, this Hippodrome was used as a propeller factory during World War II and it had to be torn down afterwards. And so the Coliseum that we know today was built right after that. I mean, look at this crowd. And it keeps panning. And then it's going to show the grandstand in a little bit too. It's truly astounding to think of this many people gathered to hear a Norwegian church service. Are you getting a little jealous right now, guys?
I really love that.
I mean, maybe we can try and replicate this in a few years. What do you think? And this is Stu, the guy who delivered the sermon in Norwegian at St. Olaf. The students all understood, even though they say they didn't speak Norwegian. Bishop of Oslo visiting from the Church of Norway. And that's a lot like the collar that you're going to be wearing on Sunday, right?
Yeah, somehow.
Okay. At least resembles it.
Turn off my there.
I wish I could be an old-timey organist to play along.
Anyway.
So here it is in the grandstand too, which the grandstand structure is the original sermon by Reverend Madsen. It says, that's just jam-packed with people. There's an early Jews, so I'm hoping it wasn't too hot. Okay. Back to okay. So now in the centennial they had a souvenir program that was handed out to everyone. And there were many little essays and stories from different people. But this one really struck me. It was from a Mrs. Tvedt, who was an author and a homemaker in St. Paul. And she wrote, again, this is in the souvenir program that went out to all these 160,000+ people that came to the centennial. That the greatest and most meaningful work done by Norwegians in America past century is the beginning of immigration. We draw a thick line under the answer, the church. For the first immigrants, the church was the gathering place. And the church here in this country has performed its duty well by making it into a people's church. It opened the doors for free meetings of all sorts, not just church services where discussions were held, resources gathered, projects applied. The doors were open to the youth, where these people could come together, create organizations, get to know one another. So it just really struck me that she's painting this picture of how central church life was for this first century of immigration, and looking at it as this people's church, which I think in some ways is a bit like how the church is in Norway too. That it's really whether or not people might go to church on Sundays or Sunday, it's still where you go for times of tremendous celebration or sorrow, and there's still that strong affinity and gathering place for the church. And I think it's in many ways what we are here too. That it's church, it's Norwegian, it's the language, but it's all these traditions and things that we put together, both Norwegian and Norwegian American traditions. And I think of Lutefisk, I think frankly is probably more of a Norwegian American tradition at this point. And we welcome so many different people of different stripes, even a associate member like myself that's actually Catholic. We bring in all sorts of different people in this church. I'm just going to finish up the little slideshow by just focusing on Eastfold's face while I talk a little bit, because so central I think he is. So I have really nothing more to show on the slides. But so after the centennial, the congregation commissioned several fundraisers, people to do fundraising, gave them little, many cases, cuts of the intake to get them going. And Eastfold was really pushing them to center their fundraising efforts around this narrative, around the story, and building it as a memorial church to a memorial for the centennial of Norwegian immigration. And in one letter that the congregation itself sent out to all the big dogs, they were using a term I'd never heard before, Yankee-itis, but Yankee being like English Americans, that they lamented how many Norwegian Americans had been infected with what they called Yankee-itis in the past 10 years since World War I, and rushing to drop all identifiably Norwegian elements from their lives. And so they urged all the big dogs to contribute to the building of this church as both a memorial and a kind of antidote to this Yankee-itis. Be proud while still being American. In reviewing the centennial celebration itself, a lot of Norwegian American history scholars kind of view that big centennial celebration as sort of the last hurrah of a big, thriving, vibrant, loud Norwegian American culture. And after we certainly preserve it, but it was diminished after that because it just sort of melted into the melting pot, for better or worse. And so I think to myself, as I'm looking at the forming of this church, this is my opinion. As everyone else is moving in one way, here we are moving to create this Norwegian-speaking memorial church. Does that make us a bit of a contrarian group of people? A little bit content to go against the grain? I like to think so. So I want to go forward now to the groundbreaking of the church and how this was talked about, what this meant. Once they finally they got enough funds together to get this place built. It was in May of 1926, so less than a year after the centennial celebration, they succeeded in getting enough funds to start the building. And it was Pentecost Sunday, actually. So I just want to read Eastfold's speech that he gave at this, because I think it's poignant and helps us, I think, to remember what they were thinking at that time, and hopefully understand what we are today. So it seems in this moment almost surreal to be gathered here to celebrate the establishment of a Norwegian memorial church in an American city like Minneapolis. We are gathered here as Americans of Norwegian heritage. None of this means dissatisfaction with this country, its people, or its language, nor that we want to set up in Norway and America. The Norwegian language and the Lutheran faith served as a great connecting point among Norwegian immigrants and brought them together so they could put down roots, build up, and become a strong presence in this new country. The preceding century, again, we're talking in 1926 here, the preceding century marks a major chapter in Norwegian American history. Nothing could be a more fitting 100-year memorial for us than a church. At the close of this century, from when the slooper sailed from Stavanger to now, we established this Mindekirken, this memorial church, as a lasting memorial of the momentous event that is Norwegian immigration to America. This Norwegian congregation will stand steadfast upon apostolic Lutheran Christianity and will maintain the language that our forefathers brought with us as heritage, for as long as it can serve to build the kingdom of God. How long that will be, we leave to God and the future to decide. We are standing here now on the lot where the Norwegian Memorial Church will stand. The Norwegian congregation and all its friends are overjoyed that it has reached so far toward its goal. The glory of the Lord, and as a witness to our continued work to preserve the truth and pass it on to our children, as we received it from our parents. In the name of the Lord, I will now, on behalf of the Norwegian congregation, lift the first shovelful of earth and lay the first stone for this Norwegian Centennial Memorial Church. The work is hereby begun. May the Lord, by his grace, grant his blessing upon it. And there are a great, diverse many from all the nation's corners who will come through this church home that we here shall raise. And our dear friends who have yet to arrive from our homeland will find themselves here at Mindekirken, where they will receive the most hearty welcome. And one of the reasons this church is being built is, of course, for them. And now fast forward to 1930 when the upper building was completed. So this was the groundbreaking that in a few months opened up the lower level. They started holding services for 4 years in the lower level here while they were building up above. At the dedication of the completed church, it received enormous press attention locally. I mean, in the Minneapolis Tribune, before it became Star Tribune, the Norwegian papers, obviously, even the Swedes talked about it in their paper. The governor came and spoke at the dedication of the church in 1930. And in every paper, the story was consistent, including from the Swedish paper I read, that to describe this dedication of this church as a church being built to memorialize the centennial of Norwegian immigration to America. So I just want to plant that thought. I'm going to wrap up with a little bit more, but I want to plant that thought of that line isn't the same as the line that was in the newspapers in late 21 and early 22 of what the congregation was about. It's not different per se, but it's not the same. It's maybe more. It's not contradictory, I wouldn't say, but in those early years, it was about holding onto the language, making a home for new immigrants. Now, fast forward to 1930, and the little soundbite coming out to the public of why this church existed was to memorialize the centennial of Norwegian immigration. So, Mindekirken entered this new building, by the way, in 1930, having raised what today would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they raised it from not only all over the Twin Cities, but really all over the country, maybe a few gifts in from Norway, but it also opened with about $1 million in today's dollars of debt at the beginning of the Great Depression. So it had its work cut out for it to get out from under it, but that's a story for another day. But the point is that it really was, it was the passion project of a small group of people, including useful, but it was also really a project of buy-in from the larger Norwegian American community. And so I say, we started as, and we stand today as, a living and a lasting memorial to the story of Norwegian immigration. So what does that all mean? And again, I'll remind in 3 years' time, we're going to be celebrating that bicentennial of Norwegian immigration. And celebrations, again, are likely to look pretty different. Again, there will be something in New York, but I'll be darned if the New Yorkers will hog all the spotlight. We're going to do something here. But the point I want to have us hash out today is, what does that all mean for Mindekirken? And I'm a little bit open-ended on that to start. I have some questions of my own in mind I might come up with, but I'm a little open-ended on hearing from you comments and questions of what does that mean? What should that mean for us to be and continue to be this memorial church? So that I'll open it up for questions. I don't know if we have a roving mic, but if you want to just tell me your question and I'll repeat it into the microphone, and the same thing goes for the Zoom listeners. And I'm going to shut off my share screen here, Zoom people. And also, in Zoom visitors, ask your questions in the chat window, please. Okay, so first I've got a question from Leon Johnson that about Chicago also having a Mindekirken. There's this spelled slightly differently. Theirs is the more 20th century spelling with the two N's, and ours is the Riksmål, Danish-ish spelling, M-I-N-D-E. She's asking, oh, thank you, if we know why theirs is called this too. I gotta be honest, I don't really know. Maybe somebody else knows. But one key difference that I'll point out, maybe two key differences I'll point out. One, it was an existing church that then took on the name. That's one. And then two, even if it was a memorial to Norwegian immigration, we are the Norwegian capital of America, not Chicago. And that's why we had the big celebration. So, hooey to you, Chicago. Anyway, but I mean, we have, I know we have several who have had contact with Mindekirken in Chicago and have visited them, get the newsletters, and I myself haven't had a chance to visit them. They also, I believe, no longer have every Sunday services in Norwegian, but they still maintain themselves as a sort of cultural hub too. So, so we have a lot in common, of course. All right, we have a question in the audience here.
I have been a member of Central Lutheran since 1959, and I kept hearing about J.A.O. Stu, and I heard you mention him as part of the initial planning here, and I know that we've been having we have a centennial a couple years ago, and I'm just wondering what connection, how he proceeded to develop another church. You know.
Yeah, well, I will say a couple things, and if there's anyone else more knowledgeable, they can chime in. But and I'm sorry if I made any misunderstanding. So Stu wasn't much directly involved with this congregation, but what he was at the time was the head of the NLCA, of the denomination, and so he was the one that gave the sermon at St. Olaf College that in 1919 that Rolvog was joking about, and he gave the sermon at the state fairgrounds, and so he was the leader of the denomination at a time when most of its churches were rapidly switching from Norwegian to English, and so he was certainly supportive of that move because he saw it as necessary politically to do, but he was also supportive of the efforts of some underlings like Eastfold to set up this church to stay home. And I'm sorry, I realize I don't know if I repeated your question for the Zoom listeners. You were asking about Reverend Stu and his, from Central Lutheran and his connections and meaning to here. But I'll also say Central Lutheran, it wasn't as integral a part of the early history of this church as the Bethlehem, for example, was, which wasn't on Lindale at the time. I can't remember where it was, but not far from here. But it wasn't non-existent either. There was a relationship. There were many members of Central Lutheran who were early supporters as associate members or friends of the congregation. So certainly for Stu as a leader, he saw the benefit of setting up this congregation. I haven't necessarily come across anything that says that Stu himself as leader of the NLCA was for, against, neutral, even aware of efforts to christen this place as a memorial church. I don't know that. All I know is that he was supportive of the idea of setting up this Norwegian language spiritual home for Norwegians in town, as this place started out as. So now I've got a question from Zoom crowd, from Gracia. Oh, and she corrected me, actually, the steward that you were mentioning is the son of the steward that spoke at St. Olaf, so oops, sorry. It's just a lot of stewards. Well, these Norwegian names, you know. Okay, but she also says, thanks for drawing this line for me. Eastfold is really important. He did mention this 1917 one in Stavanger, but then it died. I have always thought the mission versus memorial to the immigration is a bit complicated. And I agree. It's not the spiritual mission aspect. That's well stated. Right? So there's the spiritual mission aspect and the memorial aspect of this church. And I for one don't think that they're mutually exclusive or in competition with each other necessarily. I think they're complementary. But I think it's relevant and important to just ponder that they're not the same thing. You know, this is a landmark. This is a draw. This is a destination place for many. And it's the question is, could it? To me, the question is, could this be as lively and relevant to the memorial without the language? And when I say language, I don't just mean the language currently spoken on NRK, on Norwegian television. I mean also the language that we all bring over with us and that develops here among us as Norwegian Americans. And kind of come up with our own jargon. And sometimes our dialects, like my mother, goes back to visit Kristiansund, where she's from, and she's like a living museum for the dialect because her dialect doesn't exist anymore. And so that's, and I'm trying to learn hers. So as best I can, I'm trying my very best to sound like a country bumpkin, to drown out the Oslo dialect I learned when I was in school over there. The point is, could it, the language has a part to play in us being this living memorial to the Norwegian American story, which is now almost 200 years old. So was there another question out here? Okay.
This is terrific program, thank you. You mentioned mission and memorial and living and lasting. I think that's a dilemma for the entire Lutheran Church, particularly in this region. Congregations that are holding on to what was, but really struggling with what will be. And many are just basically dying. We might have a cemetery association that's thriving, but they don't have anybody in the church and no children. You want to speak to that at all as far as where that's happening for this beloved place?
Well, I want to come at it from a place of hope and optimism, and I don't know if that makes me Pollyanna, but that, you know, even from the early days, they would talk about it as a church full of old people, and they, you know, they had the young people's society, the youth group that came over from Bethlehem, but often the church members that were active on the council would lament that the people from the youth group they didn't really see on Sundays. They would have their gatherings, and not a lot of them would come to services on Sunday. And part of that is also, you know, and it's maybe common in a lot of Christian countries, but I think it's especially in Scandinavia, Norway is what I know best, is this separation between high church and low church, where one might go to a prayer meeting or sing hymns with each other, but either wouldn't feel worthy or wouldn't want to bother with stepping inside of a church unless they absolutely had to. And for a variety of different reasons, you know, everybody everybody's story is different, but we even saw that in the beginning of this congregation before it had a permanent church home, that it was heavy emphasis on low church. It had a lot of revival meetings, prayer meetings, singing together. It was not as heavy on the focus of activity wasn't as much on liturgical gathering, and so I think the tensions always existed. I recognize that the times are different now than they were a century ago, but I just think that this church has a long history of seeming like it's a church full of old people, and about to fade away, but it's still here. And I could be wrong, but I think that this church could even be an exception to the wider rule. You know, if there are other churches who are struggling, we have a unique story at Mindekirken that I think can position us to stick around.
I have another issue that I'd like to bring up, and
Yeah.
I think it's related to the fact that our founders were very courageous, because at that time, in 1918, was really the purge of language and trying to get everyone to speak English. And they needed to go through quite a bit of discussion in order to get approved as a congregation to speak Norwegian. Did you read anything about that and how they were able to speak in getting that?
Yeah, so Marilyn's question was for the Zoom audience, is about the courage it took for the early founders of the church, pushing against the grain to get really authorization, permission, blessing to conduct their affairs in a region rather than English. I personally didn't see much. Gracia might chime in the chat here with some about individual struggles they might have faced to get permission. But what I would say is that some of the very same voices in the NLCA, the denomination, or elsewhere, who were pushing the hardest for switching to English rapidly to show everyone else how patriotic Norwegian Americans were some of the same voices supportive of this congregation in 1921-22. So it was a very different atmosphere in 21-22 than it was in 25, when that centennial celebration happened. So it was much more feverish about dropping the language at that time. And by the time 1925 came around, certainly there was still that push to Americanize, to drop languages. But it was also a time of tremendous celebration of the Norwegian contribution to America. I mean, keep in mind, the president came just to speak at this. And travel was more difficult then from Washington, D.C. than it is now. But he came and he addressed a huge crowd of people. And a part of that is perhaps that Norwegians are positively targeted as being a good immigrant group, even today sometimes. But part of it was that it was a little different than it was in 2022. It was less pressure, and so to create this, to frame this place as being a memorial to that story, I don't know if that would have gained the same traction if the centennial had been in 1921 or 22. Would that have gained the same traction to try and build the church memorializing the Norwegian American story? I don't know. I'm going to switch to Zoom participants here. Yeah, and Gracia is here again our chair of the Centennial Committee and a great historian of the church. She's emphasizing just how much of a young people's congregation it was to begin with in those early years, because it was such an evangelistic effort in those first couple of years, especially in Munson. The pastor came on in 1926, I think, was himself an evangelist at heart, and really pushed for a draw for young people. So I mean, that was different. And yeah, and Gracia does point out there were some church leaders in the LCA who were not happy with this church's decision to permanently be in Norwegian. I think I would speculate they were more okay with it being a transitional use. That's why that one listing, I think it was in one of the newspapers before the founding of the congregation, they talked about it being in Norwegian for 15 years. So it wasn't a given that we would automatically become what we are now. We have others. Okay. Oh, we got another one. Okay. Hi.
Just some thoughts here. It seems that there's a little bit of flexibility in the use of the word memorial. Like sometimes it's referring to that Stavanger ship arrival, and other times it's referring to that huge celebration of 150 or so thousand people. So it seems like for the future we would widen it a little bit, because I like to think of it as a place, it's a repository for all things Norwegian. Like I was attracted to this church because I got into this basement somehow, I don't know how, but I just love that Rosemont. And I started thinking this is like a treasure chest of art. Like upstairs is stained glass windows. And then, I mean, I know with the event center, the wonderful partnership. But like Norway, all things Norwegian, I mean, I'm in the United Nations Association, and year after year, the indices about world well-being, Norway's always at the top, both prosperity and happiness. And Minnesota is always at the top among our states for prosperity and happiness. I think a lot of it is the Norwegian, the Lutheran aspect as a foundation of it. And so we should be proud of our political and lifestyle contribution, that the partnership with the event center. The spiritual underpinnings are so important, and so we're going to keep that as a broad focus, not just political or ethnic, but the faith of the people.
So the comment for the Zoom crowd was thinking about what memorial means, that sometimes referring to the Stavanger ship, sometimes referring to that centennial celebration in 1925, can we broaden that going forward to this repository of all things in the region? And I would add to that the repository of all things. This is just my perspective, Norwegian American, because I think of Rosemont. You specifically mentioned coming to the basement and staying in Rosemont. That is a tradition. It's alive and well now in Norway, but not that long ago it wasn't. But it was alive and well in Norwegian America, and Norwegian artists came here to learn some of it. And so I mean this is our story too of Norwegian American. You talked about Minnesota and the standing it has relative to other states, and Norway's standing relative to other countries. I just think of the little things in this church that are specifically Norwegian American. I know I picked on lutefisk earlier. I make lutefisk, but I don't eat it. I also think of like the in the stained glass windows upstairs, we have Hauge, who is a theologian, pietist, had a much greater influence on Norwegian American churches, I think, than Norwegian churches of today. I might be wrong. Rachel will chime in if I'm wrong about that. But that just strikes me as something that really is indicative of a Norwegian American flavor that this place can be. And so it's, Norway House that I work at, we brand ourselves as this bridge connecting from the United States to modern Norway through arts, business, and culture. That's our motto. But this place can be too. That it can act as this spiritual, cultural bridge between Norwegian America and Norway, and this repository of the Norwegian American story. The same way as Vesterheim is a museum. So we don't want to be a museum, but they're an active institution too. And so in that same way, we can be this physical repository, but also a living, vibrant group of people. It's a repository for the Norwegian American story. Make sense. Let me see how many things Gracious correcting me on here. 1 second. And yeah, she talks from her research in 1928, which is again was a couple years before the full building was built, but a couple years after that speech, groundbreaking speech from Eastwell that I read to. Every indication was when they're talking of memorial, they were specifically meaning Norwegian American, not Norwegian, but Norwegian American, so that it is really about our story as Norwegian Americans.
So this has been really good. I just wanted to say I was down at Vesterheim in July, and they, with their new outdoor buildings, and they have an outline of the restoration ship right in the sidewalk. So you can get a good idea of how big the ship was. I got seasick just looking at it.
It wasn't
I
very
thought,
big.
no way would I come across the ocean in this little.
But it was just for Zoom. It was a quick comment that Vesterheim has a sidewalk outside of the building. They have like an outline of the restoration slooper, which was very big. So how harrowing that would be. You'd get seasick just looking at the outline.
Thank you, Joe. This has been a wonderful presentation, but you brought something up that made me think about something I should announce. And that is that we have the representation of 2 very significant artists, and the congregation over the years was able to organize this. The first one was part of the building of the church, and we have we have a renowned artist that was involved in the carving of the altar and many of the wooden objects that are up in the sanctuary, and that was Leif Melgaard. And he was a self-taught carver and also was recognized by Vesterheim as kind of the groundbreaking for the gold medalist for carving. And he has not only the altar that he carved, but there is a beautiful carving of the head of Christ that's in the narthex, in the opening, right before the you enter the church, and it's on a wall, and it's a beautiful carving. He was one of the first artists recognized by the president, and so he, as far as folk art, and when they first gave those awards out, And so we are fortunate that he was a carver. The second person was a gold medalist for rose mowing. And the rose mowing that we see in this room was done by Addie Piddlecup. And she was a renowned gold medalist, and she did a wonderful job with rose mowing, and that's been preserved. So I thought I should add that since we have artists. And thank you, Joe. This has been a wonderful session for everybody. And please come next week. We will have another fine program with Jen Stala. Thank you.